Hudson Institute. My name is Matt Boyce. I'm a senior fellow here, and we have a very interesting program for you this morning. But what I should also mention, we have 4 MPs from Ukraine today. So this is a special honor for us who are here on an exchange program. So special welcome to our MP visitors from Ukraine. Today, we will discuss the results of an outstanding study which was written and published by 2 outstanding think tanks, the Center for the Study of Democracy in Sofia and the Study for the Research on Energy and Clean Air in Finland. We have, but I don't want to study to steal your thunder. So I'll just simply say that the study is entitled "Sanctions Hypocrisy," and so you kind of get an idea of what it's about. But the point is that it deals with generally with the lack of sanctions enforcement mechanisms, as well as loopholes and weak laws and enablers, and that the role that those factors play in weakening European energy security and democratic resilience, and of course, enabling Putin to prosecute his war against Ukraine. So the study updates another study which the same team published a few months ago in May, entitled "Kremlin Pit Stop: Financing Putin's War," that presented very interesting findings about the role that various countries are playing in enabling Russia to bypass sanctions and continue exporting energy to Europe. This thus prolonging dependencies in certain EU member states and enabling Russia to weaponize energy. So, and of course, your study was published today, a summary of that was published in Politico Europe. So those of you who wish to look at that can do as well. There's also a flyer outside on the counter, which where you can point your phone at it, and the QR code will allow you to download the study. It's quite interesting. So, introducing our terrific Bulgarian, UK, Finnish, Romanian delegation, and of course, joining us from Brussels. So I should start with Laura Kövesi, the European prosecutor, who's joining us from virtually, obviously. Thank you, Madam, for joining us. Hello from Washington. I understand that you'll be with us for the hour, so thank you very, very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us. And here in person, we have Ruslan Stefanov, Program Director at CSD, and his colleague Martin Vladimirov, who's responsible for the Energy and Climate Program at CSD. And we also have Isaac Levy, who is responsible for the Europe, Russia, and Energy team at CREA. So welcome to you all. So before we start, Ruslan, would you like to just maybe say a few things about the study and about your work in this issue? Because you've been publishing study after study after study on this nexus of issues that have really contributed to our understanding of these complicated issues.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks to Hudson for hosting us for a second time this year. We really appreciate our joint work. And as the title of our newest study could say, which got the waves in Brussels this morning, Sanctions Hypocrisy, we've been a little bit exasperated with the speed of sanctions enforcement, and of course with this incrementalism that we've seen in both the US and the EU policy towards getting Ukraine that support, and of course preserving Europe's interest in terms of economic security. So I'm really happy that we're joined by Prosecutor General Laura Kövesi today. I mean, she's done a lot. I can see that already being acknowledged in the European media, but we do hope that in terms of sanctions enforcement, with the new commission being unveiled today by President von der Leyen, and with the further focus on which I hope to believe that we helped steer in that way, with further focus on democratic resilience, economic security, and sanctions enforcement and transparency. I hope that we will get more powers into the hands of the European Public Prosecutor, so that we could actually get a common front in Europe on sanctions, and so that we don't see these illicit financial flows and strategic corruption coming from Russia and China continue to poison the well. And I think my colleagues will go from CREA and Martin from CSD will go in further detail. But again, the big message is we need to act bolder and swifter because we see time and again that the sanctions and the big amount of sanctions that we've imposed on Russia, and also the many institutions that we've created, a lot of efforts that in particularly Europe has put up from scratch in the past 2 years, we need to bring them to faster fruition as quickly as possible. So I hope that today's discussion is going to help us move further along, and we look forward also to the coming weeks and months to continue that work. Thank you.
Yeah, the results are really quite interesting. So what we'll do now is we'll go to Isaac first, and then to Martin, and then we'll go to Madam Kövesi in Brussels, and then we'll go to you, our guests, in person. I'm sorry we can't go to our online visitors right now. So okay, so Isaac, you have a study. I think we're going to put it on the screen, I think, hopefully. And you'll have a chance, and then you'll go through some, half of it or so, and then Martin will go through the rest. Thank you.
Exactly. So I'm Isaac Levi. I'm team lead for the Russia-Europe project at the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. I want to say a huge thank you for hosting us today, for Matt and everybody else's time at the Hudson Institution, also for Center for the Study of Democracy, and also a shout out to our colleague Vipav, who's done a lot of the work drafting this report, which came out this morning, covered by Politico and lots of other secondary media outlets in Europe and beyond. So today's presentation, I'm going to apologize in advance for maybe getting a sore neck, but I'm going to do a bit of turning. So strengthening the energy sanctions and stopping Russian oil flowing into the USA. That's going to be our focus today. Next slide, please. So just a very brief introduction to CREA. What do? We are a research institution, an independent one that is tracking Russia's fossil fuels in all its entirety out of Russia. On the right-hand side, you can see our live counter, which should be counting Russia's fossil fuel export earnings. We use an array of different data sets, tracking AIS transmissions from ships transporting oil, coal, and gas out of Russia. So we provide analysis on the impact of sanctions at hitting Russia's export revenues, and also looking at providing analysis of loopholes in sanctions, and one of those we're going to focus on today, called the refining loophole. The next slide I'm going to talk about is about the US's role in sanctions. So previously, before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, so taking the year of 2021, the USA imported around $1.1 billion every month of Russian fossil fuels. And they were the third largest supplier of fossil fuels to the USA. The USA acted very quickly, and with the invasion starting at the end of February 2022, by March, Biden had announced a ban which came into force in April. So they were one of the first nations to ban Russian fossil fuels directly. However, there's a huge loophole that we're talking about today, the refining loophole, which legally enables Russian crude oil to flow to countries such as Turkey, China, and India that do not impose sanctions on Russia. They can refine it into oil products, mostly gasoline and diesel, that are then sent back to sanctioning countries such as the USA. And this is a report we did earlier this year with CNN to show the magnitude of this. Next slide, please. A little bit of background before we delve into the report. So how have Russia's export revenues held up since the invasion? So on the left-hand side is a screenshot from our weekly snapshot that we produce, looking at the export revenues Russia receives from the different types of fossil fuels. You can see, obviously, oil is the largest one. And after the first year of the invasion, Russia's export revenues spiked. They increased. This is due to rises in prices, due to risks perceived in supply of fossil fuels and rising energy prices. The second year of the invasion, Russian fossil fuels fell about 30% to 279 billion euros, and have remained relatively stable ever since. In 2023, the Kremlin tax revenues from oil and gas has fallen. Partly this is due to the sanctions, and which has forced them to offer discounts to their oil in finding new buyers. Next slide, please. This is a complicated chart that I won't go through in lots of detail right now, but what it does is it shows the impact of the different sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. So the current sanctions, we estimate, have reduced their export revenues by around 12%. It's around $3.9 billion per month. So it has an impact. And you can run through those this is our second year of the invasion report. But you can see that one of the biggest impacts was the price cap and embargo on Russian crude oil, hitting their revenues by around 17%. Korea provide an array of different policy recommendations, and we forecast that further sanctions could hit Russia's export revenues by around 32%, or $7.6 billion per month. Next slide, please. So who's buying Russian oil since the embargo? Well, usual suspects perhaps. China have increased their purchases. India have increased Russian crude imports from over 100% 1 year after the sanctions were imposed. Turkey has popped up as becoming the largest buyer of refined oil products since the ban came into force from Europe in February 2023. And those imports have also risen over 100% too. But Russia's very good at finding new markets as well, such as Brazil and Malaysia, snapping up increasing quantities of mostly refined oil. Next slide, please. Now it's time to focus a bit more on this loophole in the sanctions, the refining loophole. So in 2023, we've seen this trend rise. So a 40% increase in oil products into sanctioning countries coming from those refineries that run partially on Russian crude. This loophole has raised the price of Russian crude because it enables them to sell higher quantities and supply markets such as the USA, EU, and UK. Within a year since the implementation of the crude oil ban, around $9.5 billion of oil products were sold that are estimated of being produced from Russian origin crude. It's a very feasible policy to ban. This chart on the bottom shows that these oil products that are imported in sanctioning countries make up a mere 3% of their total imports, and they're only offered at about a 2% reduction in price in the case of the UK's case study. So it wouldn't be inflationary to ban them. Next slide, please. So as you can see, the headline is on the bottom left from Politico this morning, covering our analysis, talking about the sanctions hypocrisy, in which sanctioning countries imported around $2 billion worth of oil products made from Russian crude from 3 refineries, the Tupras, Star, and is the Aliaga refinery, in the first half of 2024 alone. So Turkey's dependence on Russian crude has massively skyrocketed from around 34% in 2023 to around 70% in the first half of 2024. So this problem is getting much bigger. It's not going away. Next slide, please. So where is Turkey exporting its oil products to? This chart on the bottom shows the 3 refineries partially running on Russian crude and the increasing quantities they're sending their refined products mostly to the EU, but also to the US as well. So their exports have increased over 60% in the first half of 2024. And additionally, exports to the US have tripled. And this has generated around $140 million in tax revenues for the Kremlin from those US imports in the first half of 2024 alone. I'm now going to pass on to Martin to talk a little bit about Lukoil.
Thanks so much, Isaac, and thanks so much for this partnership that we have built over the last year or so, which have produced great impact, and thanks for your amazing work on getting all this data. This partnership, just to kind of open a side note, has led to the lifting of the derogation on the EU oil ban in Bulgaria. So Bulgaria has stopped buying Russian crude oil thanks to our work, and limiting the revenues to the Kremlin by $1 billion this year. So I just wanted to point out some specific cases from our assessment published today, and also then zoom in on natural gas, because natural gas is the other side of the coin, which is a little bit more problematic from a geopolitical point of view, from contractual point of view. But first, I wanted to focus on one specific refinery, which is the Star refinery in Turkey, which is owned by the Azeri state-owned oil and gas company, SOCAR. It has increased significantly its purchases of Russian crude oil over the past year, actually since October. Now 98% of all crude oil imports to the refinery are coming from Russia. And 70% of those are coming from one single company, Lukoil. So Lukoil has played an outsized role in this re-exporting of petroleum products to the West because most of the exports of the Star refinery are going to EU countries and to the US. Just a fun fact that we calculated in the past couple of days is that US imports of Russian-made refined products coming from the Star refinery have fueled more cars than there are registered in DC over the past 6 months. So we're talking about the first half of 2024. Apart from that, Lukoil has a sprawling network of fuel distribution companies and subsidiaries and partners all across the EU. And as you can see on this graph, you can see which are the main enablers of this increased petroleum product imports in the EU. The usual suspects: Greece, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, Romania, Bulgaria. So it is very surprising to us, and maybe this refers to our title, Sanctions Hypocrisy, that a sanctioned company like Lukoil keeps on exporting huge volumes of petroleum products to the US and also to the EU. The EU does not impose sanctions on Lukoil yet, but I think this is a major loophole that the Russian company has taken advantage of. Next slide, please. Here we wanted to show a little bit how we trace this kind of sanction evasion mechanisms. As you can see on the map, this is an example of how a cargo of Russian refined products reached a terminal in Turkey, which does not have a refining capacity nearby, does not import any other fuels, but then imports large volumes of Russian heavy fuel and diesel. These Russian petroleum products are then re-exported in the same volumes to a refinery in Greece, Corinth. This specific case we have raised with the European Commission and with the authorities there to investigate further on potential relabeling of oil exports, which, by the way, is not a loophole. It's an outright sanction violation. So we hope that authorities will take this case seriously. But it's just an example of a larger precedent which shows that EU has imported $3.5 billion worth of oil products in the past 12 months. And these are all from terminals which are mostly dependent on the re-export of Russian products. This has been the case also for the US, which has imported from the same terminals 21 million tons of oil products. So what can be done? Next slide. We wanted to go over some of our key recommendations for EU and US authorities. First of all, we think that we need to ban imports from refineries using Russian crude oil. It will be very difficult to otherwise disincentivize Russia from trading crude oil with third countries like Turkey, like India, like Egypt, and elsewhere. This ban is not going to impact significantly prices of final products on EU and US markets because, for example, the deliveries from the Star refinery to the US constitute only 1% of the total US imports of petroleum products. There is a need to also target the wider network of Russian intermediaries and Russian-linked companies operating within Europe who have been facilitating these exports. There is a kind of a silent consensus in Europe that we need to allow this refining loophole to continue because, you see, this is the way to preserve prices at a lower levels. This is simply not true. Our assessment has shown that all the profit from selling discounted Russian oil products to Europe has gone into intermediaries close to Russia, and the final consumers are paying the average price that they're going to pay, whether they're buying Russian products or Saudi or any other from any other supplier. We need to sanction Lukoil-owned and operated refineries in order to align better sanction regimes between the US and the EU. I'm talking about the EU now. And this is kind of an overarching recommendation which Korea has been pushing for in the past 2 years, which is to lower the oil price cap. According to their estimates, lowering the oil price cap to $30 per barrel would reduce revenues for the Kremlin by 62 billion euros, which is enormous amount and might change the calculus a little bit about the war. Next slide. Now, switching to natural gas, and I'll be very quick here. Russian LNG and pipeline exports to Europe have skyrocketed in the past 12 months. Russia is already the second largest LNG exporter to Europe, which is preposterous considering the enormous role that the US has played in helping Europe overcome the energy crisis in 2022 and 2023. But even so, Russian LNG makes up only 5% of EU gas consumption. So fears about an increase in European gas prices is grossly exaggerated and should not be the reason why the EU policymakers are shying away from banning Russian LNG. Next slide. Same story overall in the European gas market. Russian pipeline exports have been increasing by around 50% over the last 9 months. And you can see both Turkish Stream and the Ukrainian gas transit have seen an increase in Russian gas exports. Now Russia is the second largest exporter of gas overall to Europe, basically recuperating slowly its position from before the war. 2 months ago, I would have quoted their share of the market to be 14%. Now it's already 18%. So in 2 months, they have increased their share by 4%. And part of the reason is that Russia is undercutting alternative suppliers by dumping cheap gas on the market. So many companies that have long-term agreements with Gazprom are benefiting from these discounts. But some of these companies are actually intermediaries of Gazprom, so companies that are basically controlled by the Russian company. And this strategy we call Russian gas laundering. Next slide, please. As you can see, Russia has tried to reroute the natural gas flows in 2 main ways. One is by re-exporting LNG shipments delivered to Spain, Belgium, Netherlands, and France to other countries that used to have gas supply agreements with Gazprom before these were terminated after the invasion. The other route has been via pipeline through Turkish Stream, where basically Gazprom has tried to reroute some of the volumes passing through Ukraine through Turkey. We believe that after 1st of January, when Ukraine plans to hold the transit of Russian gas, most of the Ukrainian gas flows will go through Turkey, and there is something that we call Turkish Stream 2 emerging now, which is an agreement between Bulgaria and Turkey on facilitating up to 7 to 8 billion cubic meters of more Russian gas to Central Europe from next year. This is equivalent to around $10 billion worth of additional gas exports from next year. So this is very worrying, and so the EU needs to up its game. We have several recommendations on phasing out Russian gas. Next slide, please. First of all, we need help from the US. US should sanction Turkish Stream and all Turkish Stream related infrastructure and companies that are working to make these flows possible. With this, European companies using Turkish Stream and dependent on the gas supply for Turkish Stream may use this opportunity to renegotiate their contracts with the Russian company or terminate it altogether. We can phase out Russian gas, and this will not raise gas prices. Similar with the oil issue, natural gas consumption, Russian natural gas consumption in Europe is just 8%. So yes, it's a bigger dependence, it's harder, but it's not going to raise prices significantly according to our model. Also, EU should step up its game in assuming that all gas entering from both Turkey and Ukraine is Russian by origin. Not banning it necessarily immediately, but imposing an additional surplus tax on these imports. This tax should be equal to the difference between the cheap Russian gas and the average natural gas price on the European market. So in this way, European gas companies will not be incentivized to buy additional Russian gas volumes. So this goes through a change into the EU customs regulation. Of course, this is difficult, but it's an easier option than to outright ban it before countries are ready to do that. And finally, we need to stop Turk Stream 2, which we are arguing very vocally at CSD. This is starting to happen already, and this is under the radar of EU and US authorities, similarly to how Turk Stream was designed and implemented in the period between 2015 and 2021. How can we do that? We need to use EU antitrust authorities, the EU sanctions authorities, to investigate these murky deals between Bulgaria and Turkey that have been facilitating the additional exports from Turkey, and use the powers that member states have to block such deals. Finally, I'll welcome any questions. We'll welcome any questions on these issues. And we wanted to close with a graph showing how each one of us is contributing to the Russian war effort in Ukraine by buying fossil fuels. Thank you so much.
Very powerful data that you've presented, you both have presented. Now, perhaps we could turn to Madam Kövesi in Brussels to give us the EU perspective, what you might be thinking about this, doing about this already, what you might, and how your reactions would be very helpful. Thank you again for joining us. I know you're busy, but we're really absolutely honored that you can spend so much time with us. Madam Kövesi, the floor is yours.
So, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today from Luxembourg. And I am sorry that I couldn't be with you in Washington. I hope you can hear me well, that there are no interferences across the Atlantic. I have been a prosecutor for half of my life, and I like to be direct. From my perspective, the Russian aggression against Ukraine puts all of us here in the European Union in front of our responsibilities, and I definitely want to be able to look myself in the mirror. As a prosecutor, my role is to protect the rule of law and to serve the European citizens. In Russia, justice serves the power, a despotic power. If Ukraine loses this war, the very existence of the European Union will be at stake. When the war broke out, I called the General Prosecutor of Ukraine and I asked, how can we help? As prosecutors, our options are limited, but we do have options. To show support, I traveled to Uzhhorod on 18 March 2022, and I remember very well how Europe was petrified at that time, scared of Putin. This is why, ever since, I wear this ribbon as a symbol of the Ukrainian resistance. So, we signed a working arrangement with the Ukrainian Prosecution Office. We established privileged channel of communication and provided trainings to our colleagues. I am the first to admit that this remains symbolic. I know war is primarily about soldiers, skills, bravery. I know it is about weapons, equipment, intelligence, logistics, as well as the resilience of the civil population. But war, it's also about industrial production capacities, supplying chains, raw materials, money. And this is why, together with the European prosecutors, we agreed we should do more. We stepped out of our traditional judicial restraint and started to push for improving the enforcement of the EU sanctions. And you Americans know it better than anyone, economic sanctions can be an extremely powerful tool, provided they are effective. In June 2024, the EU adopted the 14th package of sanctions against Russia for its continued illegal war against Ukraine, strengthening enforcement and anti-circumvention measures. The 14th package. I respect our diplomats in Brussels for adopting 14 packages of sanctions. Still, it has not slowed the Russian war machine enough to allow the Ukrainians to win. As long as sanctions hardly bite, they do not mean much for the soldiers in the trenches. And I have a simple question. Do we really want Ukrainians to win? Because if we really want Russia to lose, we need to do better. And I often hear this false dilemma, whether we should focus on administrative measures or on criminal law, given that the criminal proceedings are slow by comparison. But frankly, this discussion is a waste of time. You need both. Now, let's get on with it. When it comes to criminal law enforcement, as far as I can tell, there is little detection, and investigations and prosecutions of the circumvention of EU sanctions are much more difficult than they could be. For 2 years now, Commission and national authorities have tried to coordinate better to share best practices and information with close to no effect. We should have turned this page long ago. After all, we in Europe have seen this movie before. When it comes to fraud affecting the EU budget, the situation was roughly the same for decades, until it was no longer tolerable and the European Public Prosecutor Office was created. Ladies and gentlemen, the EPPO is the most powerful investigation and prosecution tool currently available in the EU when it comes to cross-border financial criminality. The circumvention of EU sanctions corresponds to this typology. We are a specialized prosecution office, and we can already deal with the circumventions of EU sanctions when linked to smuggling. I think that you will hear about us in this respect quite soon. We act as a single office with a decentralized structure in 24 countries. No one has access to more information than we do, and compared to traditional cross-border coordination methods, we are much faster. We are the best tool available in the EU to bring down those who assist in sanctions evasion. I'm also convinced that it would be much more efficient for our American counterparts to cooperate on these methods with the European Public Prosecutor Office instead of 27 different national prosecution offices. We are ready to fight criminals who conceal the origin, destination, and ownership of goods and assets falling under the EU sanction regime. Let us have slowed down the Russian war effort and, with confiscation following prosecution, even contribute to the financing of the reconstruction of Ukraine after the war. But what is missing? That the new European Commission picks up on an old Franco-German initiative and proposes to enlarge the scope of the EPPO's competence to the circumvention of EU restrictive measures. The EPPO is ready, and we should do it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you, Madam Koveshi. Very interesting, and I we're actually, what we'll do is, I've got a couple of questions, and then what we'll do is perhaps we'll turn to the audience for your questions. Since I have you on the line, as it were, Madam Kövesi, given the way in which certain EU member states are really dug into the relationship with Russia, I mean, they really depend on Russian energy. They will, of course, veto any attempts to tighten energy sanctions further, I would suspect. And everyone, I think, knows which countries those are. But so are we correct in saying that the study, which focused more on the United States, what the United States could do, that those energy-related sanctions are sort of not really realistic in the EU context?
I do not say that. I'm a prosecutor. I speak from the prosecutorial perspective. And what I wanted to say is that if we prolong the list of sanctions to 1,000, for example, but no one follows, no one investigates the circumventions of EU sanctions, we will not be efficient and we will not stop them. And until now, the involvement inside of the members of the European Union was very different. Because until now, we didn't have, for example, the same definition of the circumvention of EU sanctions from the criminal law perspective. Now we have a new directive. All the member states have to implement this. But after that, someone has to prosecute, and someone has to make the indictment, someone has to confiscate, someone has to follow this sanction. And this is not happening at this moment at EU level, because we see the differences. We have a small part of competence when it's about the smuggling, because smuggling is already in our competence, and we have few cases. But we saw, this is why I said that we saw this movie before, when it was about the frauds with EU money. In some member states, the level of detection was 0. It's the same now, and it's about the circumvention of EU sanctions. In some member states, this is treated at administrative level. In some member states, it's treated at the criminal level, from the prosecutor's perspective. What EPPO wants, and he can do it, is to investigate all these cases. We do not have this competence. And we have a Franco-German initiative who wants to give this competence to the EPPO. For me, it's very difficult to understand how a member state will vote against this, because at this moment, we are the only one who have an helicopter view, and we can make the investigations. In EPPO zone, we have 3 zones in Europe: Schengen, Eurozone, and EPPO zone. And each inside of EPPO zone is the EPPO who makes the investigation, and we are fighting with financial criminality. And also we can do it with the circumvention of EU sanctions, but we need this competence. And for me, it's very complicated, not only as a prosecutor, but also a European citizen, to understand how a member state will refuse to this competence to the EPPO.
May I follow up on that, Madam Kövesi? Would this be, this is obviously a priority of yours for the next commission. Is there, are you able to comment perhaps on how much of a priority this might be? Because you can't do this alone. You need consensus. Is this a really heavy lift, or is this something that actually is potentially realistic with the new commission taking shape today, and this actually actually a possibility?
So for me, this is the priority 0, the most important priority for the EPPO if we would have this competence to work on these cases. And from my perspective, it's something that at European level has to be done immediately, because we already lost 2 years. And we saw from the study that was presented today, there are different ways to avoid the sanctions, and even if the list of sanctions will increase, no one is following. No one punished this type of activities that we saw that were presented, and they are still ongoing.
And those are, and they're not being pursued at the national level, and so we should be really zeroing in on the national enforcement capabilities. Okay, so maybe I just have maybe one or two questions for the panel, and then we can go to the audience. So the difference between your study, sanctions hypocrisy today, plus as compared to the one that you did, Kremlin pit stop financing Putin's war a few months ago, is there any significant difference between this version and that version? Or that you can explain to because you've been doing a lot of work on this, and this is an update, a really more updated, but is there, and you've got some very, very interesting suggestions in terms of recommendations. Is there anything significant that differs now from the previous one that you just did?
Let me just say, Matt, just a tad, and I have Martin and Isaac respond, but just to agree with Madame Kövesi, that it's extremely important that we get the EPPO to get that mandate. Because what we have now is just not, we call it hypocrisy, and that's important because we've been really dragging our feet for 2.5 years. But it's also a lack of capacity. The largest countries, France and Germany, they've developed these sanction enforcement institutions and staffed it with people, but even they, with all the resources they have, they lack even remotely the capacity of, let's say, US to implement sanctions. And imagine the 27 member states, then you have all these 27 different administrations that are actually facing not just the current onslaught of evasion of sanctions, but also what we've been discussing with Ms. Kövesi in the past years, which is the strategic corruption that the Russians have been doing all throughout the years. All these networks are there too. That's why I completely agree that we need this unified approach that the EPPO is proposing to get past this incrementalism and to have a quick success, which we've already seen in the corruption work of the EPPO. And I'll defer to my colleagues on the specific question about this study. But I think this is really, really important to understand. It's not just lack of political will, but also lack of capacity on the ground. And I think there is no way we could build up this capacity in the next 5 years, even if we're working very hard on that.
Well, this is actually something that I hope you in your meetings this week, and as well as those, for example, of the visiting Ukrainian MPs, can raise on the Hill, because I agree that the likelihood of something happening in the United States is higher than it is in Europe at this point. And this the case you make is very powerful. It's very powerful and very persuasive. And I wish I had a 10 euros for every time a diplomat from a European member state says that we've cut off Russian oil or we've cut off Russian gas, because I could go on a nice vacation with that, because the narrative is we've reduced this, and of course everyone knows it's not really happening. So I don't know, maybe we're getting too down in the weeds if we talk about the difference between the previous study, and this one, but it really is very, very powerful. And your message to the United States is look at that recommendation slide and do it and implement it. Yes?
If I can mention just a sentence on the difference. What we wanted to expose this time around is that it's not only Europe which is kind of to blame for lack of sanctions enforcement, it's also the US.
Yeah.
The US has increased so much its imports of Russian-made fuels, especially from a refinery that uses entirely oil from Lukoil, a US sanctioned company. So it's very strange why this is happening, especially when it doesn't really make sense from an economic point of view. So there is a need for more US-Europe coordination, and there is also a need to talk to third countries, to enablers of Russian economic influence. Turkey is not the only player here. It's Azerbaijan, which we mentioned a couple of times. It's Kazakhstan. Mm-hmm. It's India. It's Egypt. Brazil. So we can do a deep dive case study on each one of those. Turkey is just so humongous in terms of the increase in flows and the amount of re-exports to the West, that it's just difficult to ignore anymore, I think.
Okay.
Can I add one last sentence? just to define the difference between the two reports. So one of them is a legal loophole in the sanctions, which, as we mentioned, enables the US and the EU to keep buying mildly cheaper oil products made from Russian crude. So that needs to be where the legislation changes to ban this. And it's like many cases we've seen, when there's an exemption in the legislation, a loophole, it's exploited. The US has increased its imports from these refineries running on Russian crude by 300%. The pipeline oil that goes through to Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary, those imports have gone up. And the purpose of these exemptions, for example, in the pipeline case, is to give these countries that are reliant on Russian energy a bit more time to reduce their reliance on Russia. Instead, they've used this opportunity to buy more and more. And that's something that we see. So I think, just to clarify, that's the refining loophole, which is a legal loophole. The previous report we put out on the oil products coming into those storage terminals in Turkey and being re-exported, that's what looks like a violation, because there is no transformation in the oil. It's just Russian gasoline being relabeled and sold to the EU and the US. But thanks for that.
Okay, so why don't we turn it to our guests or visitors. If anybody has any questions or comments for our panel, now is your chance. Sir, in the second row, I'll get you in a second.
Hello, my name is Nurul Rakimbek, and I represent Washington-based Center for Global Civic and Political Research and Studies. So now my question is actually to Korea and to Madam Prosecutor. I'm originally was from Kazakhstan, and we're doing research on sanctions evasion regarding those areas. And thank you for mentioning that in your presentation. There is a lot of issues we consider on sanctions evasion, including the oil. And one of the things, and I don't know if you guys looked at that, is the oil swap, which is happening through the CPC pipeline. So I was just wondering what would be the effective ways to stop that, because we know there's a lot of also Western interests there. CPC pipeline, it's a share of the Mobil, Chevron, and of course Lukoil in Kazakhstan. So that's question number one. And for the Madam Prosecutor, I would like also to ask what's the, there's a lot of things has been done. There are some things that we see taking place, sanctions happening more and more, but there are evasions every day as we speak. They find more and more shell companies. There is relocation of business to Kazakhstan, through which a lot of materials, raw materials are supplied, which makes it into the weapons for Russia to continue their aggression against Ukraine. So again, what are the best ways, maybe in cooperation, regarding those sanctioned already? And are there any secondary sanctions that are going to be planned in the next, the names are already there. For example, recently we see the deals, uranium is sold from Kazakhstan to Rosatom. So it's in the hands of evil people right now. So what are the secondary sanctions for those enablers? Thank you very much.
If I,
And maybe just another question too, sir, from the front row, our MP colleague from Ukraine.
Thank you. My name is Sergei Sobolev. I am a representative of First Deputy to the Parliamentary Assembly Council of Europe delegation, and we just are discussing the problem of sanctions for the last 2 years, maybe during each committee meeting, and of course during our plenary session. But I want to say some words and then question. Sanctions, it's very important. But how we can provide sanctions when there is a rising of prices on oil and gas? So maybe we need to find the answer on this question, first of all, on the question of prices. What we can do in order to fall down these prices? First of all, it's increasing of production of oil and gas, first of all in the United States of America, and to see all bans that now have the United States legislative base not to increase the production of oil and gas, and not only in the United States of America, as well as in Europe, in Norwegia, and other countries. First of all, OPEC and near OPEC countries that now are supporting Russia by losing the production of, first of all, oil and gas, and their productions during the last 3-4 years. Of course, we must analyze our own mistakes, and if we will compare the start of second war, Russian open aggression in 22, we can see the very interesting fact that only Northern Stream 2 was built. Just in 8 months, this war started. So maybe we must answer honestly this question. Who decided to open Nord Stream 2 after the sanctions that stopped the building of Nord Stream? And what we see now after this? Second, of course, it's a problem of Ukrainian re-export of gas to Europe through our territory. And the decision of our government to stop this from the 1st January of next year, it's still open. Why it's still open? But you maybe know that Azerbaijan now have a lot of propositions to Ukrainian government to name Russian gas as Azerbaijan gas, and again to export this gas through our territory. And we now have a very serious negotiations not to allow this to do. So I think that only sanctions, it's nothing. We need to see how sanctions, together with all other methods, can help. And the question to Madam Prosecutor, of course, if these are sanctions against exact country, it's excellent. And prosecutor office in Europe or national prosecutor office can do a lot in order to stop, for example, the production, the export of high technologies. But we must understand that it's impossible to do these sanctions only against some country. It must be a sanctions to all companies that are in this line of this production. Without this, we can't stop this. And for example, prosecutor office can do this only openly according to the law that European Union has or national legislative base has. But when it's possibility to avoid this law in legislative, very negative meaning, what prosecutor office can do? So I think that it's a very complicated question, and we need to see this everything only as a process altogether uniting all our relations with OPEC, the high of production of oil and gas just in the United States and other countries. And I think only in this case we can fall down again the prices of oil and gas. It will be a real competition of prices, because only sanctions, they will rise up the prices of oil and gas, and Russia and such countries as Russia, for example, Iran or other, even in the system of sanctions, will got more and more and more billion of dollars. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We have one more comment from our question, or whatever, intervention by our Ukrainian MP colleague, and then we can maybe come to you for general reactions to all of them.
Thank you very much. I'll be quick. Alexey Ustenko, I'm MP of Ukrainian Parliament, servant of the people. Like Madame Kavesha said, it's very important for responsibility if you don't do sanction and if you do some stuff that when countries, like one example, what they do. Some oil that is from Russia, it goes like, for example, to Egypt. In Egypt, there's mix in some factory, and for document, it's already not Russian oil, it's already Egyptian oil. It goes to Bulgaria. In Bulgaria, there is the factory that is Lukoil factory, and it's already Egyptian oil.
Exactly.
And it's a very big problem. And the same with lots of Russian minerals, with Russia aluminium, with Russia titanium, with Russia oil, gas, and etc. Madam Kövesi, I think it's more question to you. Thank you very much for your support, and thank you very much for you doing for Ukraine. And I remember lots of great things that you did. And what could be the help of Ukrainian parliament? Maybe we can make some help for those, items not to go to Europe. What could be the help from our side? What it would be necessary for you, and what could be the help to you? And thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm looking at my watch, and so maybe Madam Kövesi, maybe you could take that question first, because you may have a hard stop from your side. We have a little bit more time on ours, but yeah.
Okay, so I will keep it a little bit simple, because I'm not a diplomat or a politician. So I come back to what I know the best, and this is the judiciary. And for me, it's black and white. Either justice serves the citizens, or here we have rule of law, freedom, democracy. Or this is a world in which no one is above the law. So I'm speaking about this. This is what we have in Europe. I do not want to speak for the other side. So for me, again, the sanctions have to work. The sanctions have to hurt. And everyone knows that they are not hurting now. This is why, in this context, this idea of extension of competencies of the EPPO for the circumvention of the sanction is a step forward. I'm not saying that this is the silver bullet, but it is a necessary part of the solution if we want to win. So just to make it simple and to explain again, this is the role of justice, to prove that everyone is equal. So whatever, if they find different companies in Egypt, in Bulgaria, in whatever member states, in whatever third countries they want to go, if we have this competence, we are able to follow them, we are able to identify them, to identify all the companies, to seize all their assets, and to stop these companies, and to take their money. This is why EPPO can do it. But of course, our main competence will remain in EPPO zone, so we need to have a connection with one of the member states. And based on what everyone said, we see that there are connections with some member states. Romania, the country that I know best, no? I saw it there. If we have a connection with Romania and we have this competence, we can do it. We can investigate them. The idea is that even if these sanctions will be more and more, no one follows them, we will not win this. And for the Ukrainian side, we are in contact with our colleagues. We train them. We understood very well the typologies. We understood very well how they try to avoid these measures, these sanctions, and to continue the trade in Europe. When it's about smuggling, we can intervene in some cases, but not all the time. We have the possibility to work with the third countries. We have legal instruments to cooperate with them, to get information, to share information with them. So we are ready. From the Ukrainian side, I don't know how the parliament can help, but this pushing to have this competence in the EPPO, I think, will be very important. Our colleagues in Ukraine, our prosecutors, colleagues in Ukraine, they know about this. We spoke a lot about this. The problem is that we do not have this competence, and we have to push it. If we have the competence, I don't think they are smarter than us. And
Thank you.
We are more than.
Thank you very much. Any reactions from our panelists to any of the comments or questions raised? Martin?
Well, just to second the Madam Prosecutor's remarks, what can be done? Just say, when the gentleman from the Ukrainian Parliament was speaking, I immediately thought about how their role is to raise awareness with the European Parliament, meaning your natural kind of counterparty. And the European Parliament has been, I would say, more assertive on strengthening sanctions enforcement, on bringing together, competencies, aligning, the work of different institutions in the EU and also on the EPPO. So I think there could be more push from the European Parliament on this, because the Council, as you know, the Council of the European Union takes decisions under unanimity. So Hungary, Slovakia are blocking some of these decisions. So the Parliament could be a constructive force. And I just wanted to talk about enablers from third countries. And thank you so much for mentioning Egypt, as I mentioned. in my presentation, it's all over the place. So it's Kazakhstan, it's Egypt, it's this relabeling of Russian crude oil that's happening all the time. Same with gas, by the way. Azerbaijan, yes, it will be a Russian gas sold through Ukraine. So what can we do? Well, we have a simple solution for the gas. As I mentioned, all gas coming from Ukraine and Turkey should be considered Russian gas and should be taxed with an equivalence of the difference between the average European gas price and the price of the imports. And the money should go into a special fund to support the reconstruction of Ukraine.
Quick question. What should be the tax? It should be like stable tax, or
it should be dynamic depending on the price of the imports and the price of the TTF, which is the benchmark gas price for Europe. That's very important because the other gentleman from the Ukrainian parliament mentioned that there is a threat for an increase of oil and gas prices, which is kind of deterring Western countries to act. We think, and our analysis shows, that this is not really the case. Do you remember that in 2022, before there was any ban on Russian oil and gas imports, the prices of fossil fuels went through the roof? And at the same time, the flows of Russian oil and gas reached record levels. Russia has never sold as much oil to Europe as in 2022. So the fact that Russia is selling a lot doesn't lower prices in any case. We saw in 2023, after the ban, that oil prices actually calmed down. So it's not necessarily true that we cannot replace Russian oil overnight. We're not talking about large volumes, considering the huge EU market or the huge US market. And there is ample supply from the US and others to replace Russian crude oil. But for Russia, these revenues are crucial. We should imagine that only the EU market of oil and gas probably amounts to, let's say, 30% of oil and gas revenues in the Kremlin budget. This is huge. And not to mention all the enablers of Russian oil trade, which are benefiting from this and putting their money in Swiss accounts, UAE accounts and stuff like that, and then financing further political influence activities back in Europe using some of these profits. So there is a lot to be done. And finally on CPC, because this is very interesting, together with Korea, we are watching one tanker in August, which had loaded CPC Russian oil and did a ship-to-ship transfer in the Bay of Burgas in the Black Sea near Bulgaria. And Bulgaria imported Russian oil, which is not legal anymore. And we were investigating the issue. And apparently, this was all legal on paper, because on paper, the contract was with Kazakhstan, even though the oil is from Russian origin. So our suggestion for CPC has been that we go back to earlier times when CPC was used only for the shipment of Kazakh oil. If you remember, Russia pressured the US and Kazakhstan in late 1990s, early 2000s, to allow Russian crude oil to also move to Novorossiysk under the same pipeline. We can reverse this decision, and I think the US company's role in the pipeline can help in advocacy in DC to do this.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments?
Yeah,
Isaac?
I can come in briefly. There's a lot of great questions and a lot of knowledge on the topic, so thanks for that. I think Martin's also and Koveshi done a very good job of addressing a lot of those. So I'll try and be brief. But it's a really important message, I think, to show that Europe's reliance on Russian energy flows comes at a huge cost of risk. Like we mentioned, when the pipeline flows through Nord Stream were cut off, there was, I believe, a 200 or 300% increase in energy bills. So this reliance on Russian energy flows is very costly. We've seen Europe be able to reduce their gas consumption considerably through the development of renewable energies. This is something that we need to push forward and continue. And also, it's an interesting point on the effectiveness of sanctions at reducing energy prices. So, for example, if you look at the quantities or volumes of Russian oil being sold on the global market, it's not really gone down. It's very stable. The revenues fluctuate a lot because of the prices. So, for example, the oil price cap policy, it's had an effect. It could have been more effective. But it has forced down, along with the embargo, Russian oil prices. They've had to offer discounts of maybe up to $20 per barrel originally in the sales of crude oil to India. But the quantities of oil haven't gone down. So I think there is an argument to say if you lower the price cap and you increase the effectiveness of sanctions, you can enable combating of rising energy prices whilst also hitting Russia's export revenues. And I think one last thing I'll mention on the tax is a lot of, from our calculations at CREA, we think around 75% of all the EU's purchase of Russian LNG last year were under long-term contract. So that's what's basically a lot of evidence to show the EU needs to ban the imports of Russian LNG, cancel those contracts, and enable them to receive supply from other sources such as the USA. As well as investing in renewables, of course.
We're about 10 minutes over now, so I mean, if people have some more time or have any more questions, though, we can, and you can stay a little bit longer. Matthew, I mean, happy to continue this conversation as long as we can.
So thank you, Matt. My name is Matthew Murray. I'm an adjunct professor at Columbia University. My question is. This is specific to the United States, not the EU. Does the United States have a set of policies and programs and projects that would incentivize Turkey and Bulgaria in particular to lessen their reliance on Russian oil and gas? In other words, are we working the other side of the ledger to make sure that companies, specific companies, and the governments of those two countries can reorient themselves based on, carrots, not sticks, because sanctions will not, I don't think, solve all of these issues. These are systemic issues, and I'm just curious what your assessment is of the state of U.S. policy to create incentives with Turkey and Bulgaria in particular.
Well, in our June report, which we presented here as well on phasing out the Russian gas, we noted that all of Southeastern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe as well has 3 times more available capacity for imports of alternative supply of natural gas than the Russian gas flows at the moment. So the region can import much more LNG from the US and elsewhere than it does right now. The reason why many of these countries are not doing, including Bulgaria, doing this, is because Russia is providing discounted natural gas. The discounts are between 20 and 25%. And it's very difficult to convince these companies to switch suppliers without any incentives. So there could be also more coordination between the EU and the US on the redirection of LNG flows to Europe and away from China and Asia. And we always get this answer from DC, well, we cannot really make companies take different decisions. So they choose the destination which has the higher price, and Europe has been competing with Asia on prices, and this is very difficult, which, this increases price. But I've seen some of these contracts between US LNG exporters and European companies. And sorry to say, a little bit cynical and kind of critical of the US on this side. Some of these conditions are extreme. The US LNG exporters are asking for very, very high prices. And I think the US government can provide different indirect incentives to LNG exporters, like tax cuts, kind of subsidies, or I don't know exactly, but incentives so that they don't push prices to the limit for the European consumers and provide incentives for these companies to buy more US LNG.
Okay, so unless there are any more urgent questions, I think we'll maybe call it a day. We're running. Thank you for staying. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for staying so long. Thank you most of all to our panelists and to our guests from Ukraine for joining us. Thank you all for a fascinating conversation and a brilliant study. It's the QR code is over there for you all to download. Sanctions, Hypocrisy, and Kremlin, and Pit Stop. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.